Madam President, I move that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm here today to talk a little about the bill that we saw posted late last night, a bill that I think has better results than the process itself would have suggested we might have. There's no question that we have to get back to the process of bringing these bills to the floor, bring them to the floor one at a time, let everybody challenge every penny of spending, to spend it in a different way or don't spend it at all. I'm disappointed, as every citizen of the country should be, that we didn't do it that way, and hope that we have the opportunity next year to get back to where these bills are dealt with one at a time. The other area that I'm disappointed in is the inability to use this bill to really have the kind of policy victories that I'd like to see. The rule on waters of the U.S. that the courts appear to be consistently saying the EPA absolutely doesn't have the authority to do what they're trying to do. The rule on electricity that in my state, the fourth most dependent state on coal-powered utilities, will double our utility bill sometime between now and 2030. And for some Missourians, their utility bill will more than double. The rule that makes it difficult for financial advisors to give advice to small investors and people who have small savings, people who have small retirement accounts. If this financial advisors rule, the so-called fiduciary rules, allowed to go into effect, it will have dramatic impact there. The joint employer rule that upends the franchise model of doing business, a model of doing business that's around the world now, but uniquely American in its capacity to bring people into the middle class, allow them to rise in the middle class. So I'm disappointed about all of those things, but when you look at the bill as a spending bill, when you look at the bill as a bill that's supposed to do what this bill does, which is decide how to spend the country's money, there is a significant reprioritization here. Now, one of the things I've seen even more in recent years than I think used to be the case, when so many of our friends in the House and the Senate, and maybe even more so in the Senate, talk about how important it is to fund our priorities, what they're really saying is it's important to fund anything that any of us are for. That's not the way you set priorities. The way you set priorities is decide what's important for the government to do, decide what the government can do that people can't better do for themselves or maybe couldn't possibly do for themselves, and then set those priorities. In that case, I think this bill makes significant steps in the right direction, dramatic changes in areas that have been a problem for several years now, at least the last 5 or 6 years, in the case I'm going to talk about first, the last dozen years, but nobody's been able to do anything about it. Now, nobody's ever said those aren't our priorities. They've just said, well, we've got all of these priorities, which, Madam President, meant every line in the appropriations bill, the best I can tell. So let's talk about the labor HHS bill. It's about 32% of all the money after defense. If I have any time, I might talk about the defense bill, because it does great things for veterans, great things for cybersecurity, great things that really do support those who serve. And one of those things is encouraging our allies in the front lines in the war on terror. But in labor and education, particularly in health and human services, the National Institute of Health, where so much of our healthcare research is generated, a little of it's done in every state. Some states have great institutions, certainly Missouri and the University of Missouri, Columbia, at Washington University, at the children's hospitals, at hospitals all over our state that have unique opportunities to do research. Healthcare research is something that, frankly, just isn't going to happen in the way it should happen unless the government steps forward and says, we're going to be a leader here. The federal government from about 1996 until 2003 doubled NIH research. in less than a decade, doubled NIH research, and since 2003, there's been no increase. No increase in over a decade. And as that money didn't increase, the buying power of the money decreased, and you could certainly argue that somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% less buying power. So really, in terms of what they're getting for research, less of buying power by about 20% to 25%. Young researchers frustrated in never getting that first grant, never getting the truly experimental grant that sees if something will work that nobody may have ever thought of before. And this bill increases NIH research by almost 7%. It takes that 30%, that $30 billion federal commitment to research, and makes that a $32 billion commitment. It begins the process of catching up. And why do we need to do that? What are the reasons we need to do that besides the fact that the government has done research of all kinds for a long time, from ag research, which I support, to health research, which I support. But I can think just right offhand of about 3 critical reasons we should be concerned about health research. One is the individual impact that the failure to do this has. You know, as people live longer, more and more people die with Alzheimer's and its complication, or cancer and its complication. Fewer people die with heart attacks all the time because we've done great things there and can still do more to make the treatment of heart attacks, the prevention of heart attacks, even less likely. But as people survive heart attack and stroke, they're much more likely to die with Alzheimer's or cancer. All of those create great stress for families, particularly Alzheimer's can create years and maybe decades of stress for families. So to try to prevent that, to try to postpone that, to work with families, I'd say that's the priority reason number one. To save money for taxpayers would be priority reason number 2. Alzheimer's alone, the projection is that by 2050, through Medicare, the federal government will be spending $1 trillion a year on Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's-related health care. That's about as big as this discretionary budget. I think this budget is about $1.15 trillion. So take all the money we're spending today on discretionary spending, and suddenly that's the same amount of money in just a few decades we'd be spending because of Alzheimer's. So that's a good second reason. A third reason will be that healthcare is about to revolutionize everything from smartphone technology to the individual healthcare that's possible now that we know what we know about the human genome, the things that we know that make me as an individual different than everybody else, and everybody else that's hearing this different than everybody else. What kind of unique cure can we find? What kind of designer medicine cure can we find to solve a problem for you? And then how do you make that scalable so that with minor variations, you can make the same thing possible and affordable for other people as well? And where that research is done, to the smartphone technology applications, the focus on the brain, the focus on designer medicine, where that's done is likely to be where many of those jobs turn out to be. So certainly healthcare is and will continue to be a big economic driver, a very, the multiplication of economic impact in a positive way of what we invest in healthcare is pretty dramatic. So that's a big increase. Fighting opioids, the opioid abuse. This is where people are taking prescription medicines. And, you know, Madam President, you're a veteran. You just retired from your long military service. But many of our people who serve are the most likely to have this problem because the injuries they sustain, the accidents they're part of, the attacks that they're a victim of, create the kind of pain that they take heavy amounts of appropriate things to ease that pain, but then get addicted to that. This is an area that people weren't talking about long ago at all, but deaths from prescription opioids have quadrupled since 1999. Actually, maybe more than that, because they quadrupled between 1999 and 2013. And overdose of prescription drugs cost the economy an estimated $20 billion in work loss and health care cost every single year. The lives of families that are impacted when a successful person or a responsible person or someone who's not achieved either of those things yet but is a loved part of your family become victims of opioid abuse. We have a commitment in this budget to $91 million, not the biggest line item in the budget, but it's almost 3 times what we have been spending. And many of our members have been real leaders in talking about that. Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire, Senator Portman from Ohio, Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, all very focused on this problem. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, the Education Act, benefits here as we move to hopefully less federal control on education, but more ability to help local schools deal with people who have individual challenges. Rural health, a big issue in my state, and a big issue, Madam President, in your state, is handled here in a different way. Job training, an important thing we do. But what are we not doing? Here's my final addition to this. What are we not doing? We would have liked to have not funded over 40 programs, which was the bill that the Appropriations Committee sent to the floor months ago that was never debated, and then that would have been the chance to debate all 40 of those programs. I think there were 43 programs that cost about $2.5 billion. Debate all 43 of those programs and decide if the committee's right or not. You can't do that if you don't get here on the floor to do it. But we still eliminate 18 programs. Those programs currently were more than $250 million of spending. The president asked for 23 new programs that were $1.16 billion of spending that were not done in this bill. The Independent Payment Advisory Board under Obamacare, where there'd be a board rather than you and your doctor that decided what your health care was going to look like. That's not funded, so that won't occur. And there won't be a big transfer from other accounts with some other label to insurance companies because all of the expectations from Obamacare have turned out not to produce the kind of results that its supporters thought it would. So hopefully we have made a big difference in how we prioritize the spending of the people's money, of the taxpayers' money, and hopefully we've also made a renewed commitment to do this the right way. We've done it this way since, frankly, the control of the Senate changed a half a dozen years ago. The new majority was totally committed to get these bills to the floor, and they were all ready, all 12 bills for the first time in 6 years. Most of them ready about the end of May, the 1st of June, but with only a couple of exceptions were they allowed to come to the floor, and that was at the very last minute, when it was too late really for this process to work the way it should. Let's hope for more transparency, more debate, more challenges. I'm chair of this one committee I've been talking about today, but certainly there've got to be other ideas that other members who aren't on this subcommittee have, who aren't on the Appropriations Committee have. They do their best to get those ideas in by talking in this late process and during the year what should happen. Let's do our best to make this happen the way the Constitution envisions and people have every right to expect. I hope for a better process, but realize that this process does significantly change the priorities that the federal government has been stuck with for the last 6 years and heads in a new direction.